Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Suzuki in Action, Suzuki, the man and his dream to teach the children of the world. My name is Heather Meyer and I'll be running everything in the background for our session today. We are very excited to host today's webinar with the Suzuki Association of the Americas. This is our fourth webinar in our Suzuki in Action series. If you haven't viewed our previous webinars, I'll be providing links to the Alfred Music YouTube page at the end of today's session. So let's get things started. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Eri Hotta. Eri Hotta is author of Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy, a history on the attack on Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective. She has taught at the University of Oxford, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. She writes on a variety of subjects for Japanese and English language readerships. Harvard University Press published Eri's book, Suzuki, the Man and a Dream to Teach the Children of the World in November 2022, and the book was selected as a New Yorker Best Book of the Year. Eri will be joined in our webinar today by a special guest, Kristen Krauss, Eri's family Suzuki teacher. Thank you to everyone for being with us today. Eri?
Hi. Hi to everyone. I'm going to share a slide that I have prepared as I go along. I am Eri Hotta, and I'm the author of Suzuki, obviously. And I've been since its publication, I've been really overwhelmed by the positive response and kind of touched by the positive response. And it really, I think, kind of reaffirmed in me the appeal of Suzuki method and how appreciative people are and how fascinating a subject Dr. Suzuki really was. So I think in lieu of introduction, I think I'm going to talk about why I came to write this book to start with. And the primary reason why I wanted to write this book was that, of course, Dr. Shinichi Suzuki is simply an irresistibly fascinating subject. For one thing, he lived from 1898 to 1998, which is really almost the entirety of the 20th century. And for a Japanese historian of 20th century, like myself, his life offers just too many great stories and questions. And he lived through great historical turning points, including Japan's ascent as a modern power, the two world wars, and the Cold War. And he encountered a host of intriguing characters, including, of course, Albert Einstein and Jimmy Carter. I have some photos that might provide some ideas of his long and interesting life. Some of them I used in the book, some of them didn't make it in the book, but I owe Mr. Mikio Shin of the Talent Education Research Institute in Matsumoto for providing me with this treasure trove of photos. Let's see, this is Dr. Suzuki with his wife Baltrout as a newlywed, and I think it's probably from the late 1920s. It's undated, but I'm pretty sure it was like when they were on their honeymoon. Here he is. This is in the 1930s, back in Japan, with his younger brothers, who all aspired to become like his older brother and played instruments. They formed one of the first successful chamber music groups called the Suzuki Quartet, and they toured around Japan a lot. And that aspect of his life, I didn't really, of course I knew about it, but I didn't really know in depth how much of an enlightening work he did as a musician in Japan of that period. Another photo, this is immediately after the war at the Matsumoto Music School, and he's leading an ensemble. And this is actually a very Spartan building, which was used as a training house for geisha apprentices. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So that's David Oistrakh in Tokyo. It's not known that David Oistrakh actually knew about the Suzuki method well before the Americans did, because he actually encountered them in 1955 when he was touring Japan. So I thought that was quite interesting. When we think of Suzuki's global influence, we kind of think of it in terms of American channel and how it became globalized through American dedicated American practitioners. But I thought that was interesting that the Soviets knew about it too. And the picture with two men shaking hands, that's Dr. Suzuki and Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. And I think that's 1979. And of course, the first daughter, Amy Carter, was a Suzuki student when they were living in the White House. The last picture is of Mr. and Mrs. Suzuki, Dr. and Mrs. Suzuki, at the celebration of his 95th birthday in the Suntory Hall in Tokyo. So this is really to give an overview of how encompassing and intriguing his life really was. Just kind of a fascinating historical subject. But I do have more personal reason why I wanted to write this book, which is really that I was a Suzuki parent once. And my daughter, Josephine, is now 15, and it's been a while since she left the Suzuki method, but she's still dedicated to music. And when I was approached about this talk, Suzuki in Action, I thought the perspective that I bring as a Suzuki parent to this book is, of course, interesting enough, I hope. But if I could bring real Suzuki practitioner and teacher's perspective to this talk, I thought that would be wonderful. And that's why I asked my friend Kristen Krauss, Josephine's Suzuki teacher, to join us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Krauss. I have been a violin teacher for the past 30 years. I received my training from Louise Barrand, 1993 to 1995, and then began teaching at the School for Strings in New York City right after my graduation from teacher training class. In addition to being a Suzuki violin teacher, I also have 4 children, and the youngest is 18. So they've all successfully gone through the entire Suzuki method at the School for Strings. And also between the 4 of them, I've covered not only the violin, but cello and piano. So between my 4 children, I have been a parent of Suzuki students for all 3 instruments. And also my husband is principal trumpet of the Met Opera. So any Suzuki, for flute and winds, I have a lot of experience with that as well. I also run chamber music programs. I run my own summer camp called Berkshire Summer Music that I started with my husband 10 years ago. And also the chamber music program at the Rivers Conservatory in Boston. So with that, I bring a knowledge of children starting on instruments from a very young age, getting up to that intermediate level. And most importantly, in this talk, I was Josephine's first teacher. I taught her from Twinkle all the way through Bach A minor when she was ages 4 turning 5 until about age 9. And what I wanted to say here before we go on is that we will probably keep talking about violin when we talk about things, but because I am a violinist and Eri's daughter plays violin, and a lot of the Suzuki book is, of course, about him teaching violin. But everything we will talk about can apply to every Suzuki practitioner that is on right now and their different instruments. So I'm really happy to be here today with Eri.
Great. So obviously we are not going to be able to go through the whole book, but I thought it would be a good idea to give you the table of contents so that you get the sort of drift of how the book goes chronologically. And chapter 1 is a background chapter and also a historical chapter where Dr. Suzuki's story is kind of oriented within the context of Japanese modernization and his interesting family environment. And chapter 2 and 3 trace Dr. Suzuki's adolescence and mainly young adulthood that eventually led him to pursue musical studies. And chapter 4 is about that pursuit of music. It leads him to Berlin in the 1920s, where he studied with Karl Klingler and met his future wife, Waltraud, before finally returning to Japan. Chapters 5 and 6, the next two chapters deal mainly with the 1930s, when Dr. Suzuki, back in Japan, started teaching and developing the basis of his pedagogical approach. So that's actually a very important chapters for practitioners of Suzuki, even for today's audience. Chapter 7 and chapter 8, they evolve around Dr. Suzuki's post-war efforts in propagating his movement in Japan and eventually internationally. And chapter 9 tries to sort of interlace my own experiences and evaluations of Dr. Suzuki's century and my own experiences as a Suzuki parent. So Angelica has rightly pointed out that chapter 5 and chapter 6 are perhaps of particular interest to any Suzuki practitioners. These are loaded chapters. It's loaded with sort of interesting anecdotes, historical episodes, and also philosophical perspectives. But given the time limit, Kristen and I thought that perhaps we best pick out two primary concepts in those chapters. One, the importance of tone in Dr. Suzuki's teaching, and second, his insistence that we are all talented and that there's no such thing as born genius. So we are dealing with two T's here, tone and talent. I'll talk a little bit about tone, but before that, I'd like to ask Kristen about how this book might have informed her own teaching in general.
Yes, what I would like to start with is saying that I have read it twice, and that is for two reasons. First of all, I read it thinking, well, I'm going to read this and take notes right away and apply this to my teaching. I know what an amazing Suzuki parent Eri was all those years I taught Josephine, and I thought she's going to be able to share with me things that will really, spark some new inspiration in my teaching. And that was what happened. But as I started to read it, especially these early chapters, like chapters 1 through 4 that Eri shared with you, the beginning of the book, it's just such an enjoyable read. We have to remember when we're teachers and when we're teaching the Suzuki method and the repertoire, that we are part of this larger movement and method that came about in the 20th century, where many of us as teachers have lived throughout a lot of that century. And so when I started to read and thought, oh, I had my little sticky yellow papers and my highlighter, I just put that all away and I just read it. And I really enjoyed learning about so many things I never knew about this amazing man, Suzuki. As a teacher, then I decided to go back through it and highlight some points. And that's what we'll be talking about today. But just overall, it just reminds us that we are teaching from a method that was just created by such thorough thinking about education in general, and then applying it not only to the violin, but to multiple instruments. So this book can do both things for you. It can just be an enjoyable read where you learn about Suzuki, but also inspire, many points that come up that you've probably thought about every day in your teaching, or maybe some you haven't thought about in years. So that was my biggest, just takeaway as a teacher and parent and just general reader was what I really found great about the book.
Thank you so much, Kristen. You always, I don't know, make me feel good. That's great. So let's talk about tone. And I wanted to bring this this dictum of Dr. Suzuki's to attention, oto ni inochi ari, which is life is distilled in a tone, roughly translated. And the sort of that chapter is really about the primary importance that Dr. Suzuki attached to the beauty of tone. And come to think of it, I think tonal beauty is actually the leitmotif that really guided his musical life. Even when he was 17, and many of you would know the anecdote of his that's explained in Nurtured by Love, when he heard Misha Elman's Ave Maria on a gramophone, he fell in love with the voice of violin. And that's how he came into studying violin, even though he grew up being surrounded by violins because his father made violins. So he came into playing the violin late, but he had that moment of epiphany because of the beauty of a tone that he recognized, and that he wanted to be closer to that tone. And that kind of sort of absolute faith that he had in the belief of your own like hearing and ear, I think really permeates throughout his life. And when he goes to Tokyo to study and possibly enter the National Conservatory in Tokyo, he actually attends a graduation concert of students, and he is so disappointed because he said he was so used to listening to the tones of great masters on records, and what he heard really didn't come close to it. And he thought at the end of his study, that's the outcome. He doesn't want to study there. So eventually he goes to Berlin. And even in Berlin, he lets his ear be his guide and attends as many concerts and recitals as possible to find his own master teacher, letting his ear be his guide. And that's how he found Karl Klingler when he heard his quartet's Beethoven. Let's see. So that's actually the leitmotif. Tonal beauty is really his obsession, and his belief gets confirmed when he's back in Japan in the 1930s, and he stumbles into teaching partly out of necessity to make decent living. And at the music school that he's teaching, he meets this amazing talent, barely a teenager, called Nejiko Suwa, who you see holding a violin. And he actually observes from her environment. She actually didn't come from a wealthy family, but she came from a family that really valued listening to music. And even before she was able to pick up the instrument, she was listening to all the great recordings on the gramophone. So by the time she was starting to play, her ear for beautiful tones were really well trained. And that's sort of, that gave him some hints and helped him develop this idea that you have to be exposed to beauty of the sounds from early on. And much like, one has to hear a lot of repetition of your native tongue to be able to speak it, I think he really came to believe that actually repetition in hearing beautiful things, was critical in the making of great musicians. So he thought that it could be sort of socially engineered for a child to produce a beautiful tone, and beautiful tone is teachable by effective bowing technique and good ear training and so on. But here I sort of I am a bit confused, because he insists that life is distilled in a tone, sort of suggesting that your soul's expression is in the tone that one makes as a musician. On the other hand, he's also saying that tone is not a given, sort of God-given property, but something that you as a teacher can teach. So I'm wondering if Kristen could comment a little bit on this seeming contradiction on this teachability versus innateness of tone.
Sure. Well, I agree with you, Eri, that when you think of, when you hear this quote that you have, that life is distilled in a tone, and if you just think about the word distilled, that means when something is distilled and we're talking about thoughts, it means that it came from that original thought. So I think that is the part of the phrase that's explaining that he thinks that tone might be this inborn, like tone is life and life is tone, and they kind of came from each other. And that's what may suggest that having a beautiful tone, or just even knowing what you think a beautiful tone is some inborn quality. But I believe when you say you're a little confused or the contradiction in this just shows exactly where our job as teachers comes in. Most of us, or start these children very young on these instruments, and we hope that the child chose the instrument. But I know, being a parent of 4 kids, and they started when they were 3, I know I directed them in different ways, especially I had twins. So I wanted them playing different instruments. So I told my one son he loved the cello. So and he does, and he's now a cellist. So I was right. But, these kids are coming to us, and why are they coming to us? We hope it's because they love the sound of the instrument we teach. And this is where it comes into teaching the tone. This is our job. So for us, we have to set the child up on these instruments, and we also have to encourage the listening. So going back to what Eri's talked about pretty much up until this point, and when we started in on chapter 5, is that everything about Suzuki creating this method was because he loved the sound of the violin. He grew up with his father making violins. He worked in the violin factory, and he never even really played the violin up until a teenager, but he loved the violin. So if we have a student coming to us, and they're coming to us because we know they would like to create this sound they've heard, and we hope they've heard the instrument played well. This is where it's our job, A, to set them up properly. And just speaking in violin terms, we take a 3, 4, 5-year-old and even older beginners, and our first job is to set up their posture, to set up their bow hold, to make sure we are giving them the best start to this instrument. Eri and I got into a lot of discussions, in preparing for this today, and I compared a lot of that to my start being taught traditional method. That I remember just having, a method book and it on the stand, and just being told to read these notes. And when I became a teenager, I remember teachers telling me, "Are you really listening to yourself?" And I thought, I never even thought of that. Like, really, I think it took me years to think of that, where I think in the Suzuki method, and as we all as teachers are training our students how the technique of the instrument, how to hold it, how to hold their fingers at the piano, how to make sure they feel comfortable at the cello, and wind instruments, all of their unique teaching points, that when we start to teach them, the most important thing alongside of that is also just training their ear. That's why it's important to have a parent class and start the parents to have a group class, so the kids are hearing these pieces played. Of course, they have the recordings to listen to at home. Besides the recordings, it's so important, as we see from Suzuki, coming from hearing Ave Maria or, Chrysler, all these other violinists, recordings of them. We know that just to make sure the child at home is being exposed to great music. My 4 children range in age from, 7 years between all of them. They're now all 18 to 25. And when my youngest wanted to play the violin, she had already heard Suzuki books 1 through 4 every day between me teaching and her older siblings playing it. And so, yes, we had Suzuki recordings, but she just had that advantage of hearing the pieces over and over again. And then in addition, her older siblings were already playing, Beethoven, Chopin, Bach on the piano. So if you don't have that in your own home already, and maybe your students don't, it's so important to make sure we encourage the listening, because then it's the listening, besides setting them up the best we can when they begin, it's the listening then that leads us right back to Suzuki's main point, which is that this is a mother tongue approach. He felt that every child was learning to speak their language. They were learning to speak their language by hearing the sound of the language from the parents and the caregivers in the home speaking it. They were able to hear inflection in the voice. They are able to hear different moods in talking. All of that turns music into the words of language. And so that brings it right back to, if we're setting them up properly, we're encouraging their love of the instrument, but the end goal is that they make the sound that they would like to make on their instrument. And that's our job the whole way through, to help them with that. So that's where I think tone can be taught. And we're going to answer questions at the end. So if anyone has any more specific questions about that for any instrument, I'm willing to share more thoughts on it. But I think that's what leads us to being a goal, that if we can teach children language, we can teach them to play an instrument and to have a goal for a beautiful tone one day for themselves. Because in the end, tone is so personal. It's, what do you hear? What do you want to sound like? And everyone has, all the most well-respected artists, what's the most special about them? Not that they can play all the notes. Every artist that's made it to the level that we're hearing them can play all the notes, but we love something in their tone. And then that leads to also what they have to say in the music. And Eri, we can continue talking just about how even the Suzuki repertoire, or we can do this in the question and answer, how the Suzuki repertoire and the way it is built along the books also help build musicality, which lead to this gorgeous tone that we have as a goal. So yes, tone can be taught.
Great. So should we talk about the other T, talent, briefly?
Sure.
That is explored in the chapter entitled No Such Things as a Born Genius, which really is about Dr. Suzuki's lifelong quest to redefine the meaning of talent. I think to him, talent was not an inborn quality like an eye color or hair color, but rather like a muscle that can be developed and strengthened. So he knew very well, though, that the end results of that training might differ depending on the person's strengths and weaknesses, but he thought that every one of us could be trained to develop to a remarkable, surprising degrees. So that's why he wanted everyone to claim talent, every child to feel that they are talented. And that no one was sort of born genius became another credo of Dr. Suzuki's over the 1930s again, that was really a formative period in his teaching philosophy, because his studio expanded. In that decade, he ended up teaching about 100 children. He didn't start out as a specialist in children, but he acquired a reputation. I think he was something of a Pied Piper, and he adored children, and the children adored him, and he made sure that they are being taught, no matter what their differences, they are being taught effectively so that they could really maximize their potentials. And the primary examples of students from this period, the one on the far left is Toshiya Eto, and the central one is Koji Toyoda. And these two actually had very successful international performance and teaching careers. But in the 1930s, they were immediately called prodigies and geniuses because there were very few violinists who could really play that well. And I think Dr. Suzuki really hated that genius label, attaching genius label to such young children, and kept saying that, they are not geniuses, they are just being taught effectively. So I think that made him all the more determined after the war to insist that his movement be called talent education movement. And the talent education movement is not for the exclusively talented, but for everyone. So that's the origins of his special definition of talent. Quite curiously, not curiously, but kind of ironically, this was also the decade when Japan became a very dark place to grow up in because of the militarist turn in policies and Japanese invasion of China starting in 1931 and the war that started in 1937. So he was very much worried about what sort of education these young students of his were getting in the general schools. And he was so worried that he actually responded by publishing this book called Powerful Education, whose cover you see on the right. I think he painted his own cover. It's the northern landscape, I think. And in this book, he actually argues that Japanese public school has to have an overhaul, like reform, because it's not teaching children effectively and people are getting dropped out. Whereas he believed that there should be no such thing as dropouts. They are being dropped out by adults who did not take care to teach the students effectively. And here he draws back on the decade-long experience of teaching different students violin. He took on all the students without any auditions, and they came from different social and family backgrounds, but all of them managed to be able to play violins at a very high level. So he's saying that his method of goal setting, repetition, memorization, all that could be applied to all subjects in schools, and that basically teachers have to take more care about teaching students effectively and not judging, oh, he's a good student or he's already falling behind. Because the moment they enter obligatory stage of public school education, they come from different family backgrounds, and some of them might have had the advantage of having very educationally minded parents who taught them how to count and how to read. And these people are over-determined to succeed. And those who did not have that advantage regarded as kind of possible dropout candidates. So he was very much dismayed about that. And also, of course, he was dismayed about the indoctrination and militarist kind of chauvinistic culture that the school was breeding, the school system was breeding. So he publishes this really bold revolutionary tract actually in September 1941. And if you think that Pearl Harbor happened in December 1941, it's actually quite remarkable that he was able to pull this off. But of course, Japanese government didn't take heed of any of his plea or advice because they were too busy planning for a new war. So he'd have to wait another few years to really get his movement going on the ruins of Japan's defeat in World War II. So I think here I'd like to ask Kristen about his idea of, again, inborn qualities versus what is teachable. And especially in this chapter, he alludes a lot about, alludes to competition culture, like competitiveness in school, and how it can be detrimental, especially for people who are so young, to be exposed to that culture in school. So if you have like personal experiences or thoughts on that nature of competition, I'd appreciate hearing.
Yes, and I can relate it directly to the book because as Eri is speaking about powerful education and everything coming up with the talent education, the main goals there for Suzuki were goal setting, encouragement, repetition. These were the main points that he wanted to bring out as a teacher. And I know as a teacher and as a parent, especially the way the Suzuki repertoire is, a lot of parents ask a lot of time, well, how do you do this and say that competition isn't important because there's a certain number of pieces and everyone's asking everyone, what piece are you on? The kids ask the kids, what piece are you on? Everyone's playing the same repertoire. And it is I think everyone would agree with me, it is a challenge sometimes as a teacher to hold the student where you'd like to hold them and work on what you'd like to work with them without them saying, we can't wait to finish the book. We can't wait to play the piece that our best friend is playing in our group class that week. It's a challenge we face with teaching the same repertoire to the students. But what I noticed, I told Eri, as everything she just talked to you about powerful education, he goes right into talking about competition there. And I don't know, for any of you that maybe have the book right there, on page 141, and Angelica had asked me a question saying, what was my biggest takeaway I got from the book as a teacher? And I have to say, I can really narrow it down to this quote from Eri's writing of Suzuki, that on page 141, it comes right after Suzuki's talking about competition among everyone. But it says, Suzuki believed that the true value of education lay in doing and being better today than one did yesterday. And then he goes on to say, but few people actually think and live this way. So I think that a really important way for us to think of as teachers and to always remember this, and that's something you can apply to all of life, that if you'd like to improve in anything, you are improving if you can do something today, even if it's something the tiniest little bit better, but it's a little bit better than you did the day before. So can someone do something better today than they did the day before? I think it's interesting that Suzuki, when you're talking, Eri, about competition, and we go right into that's how he liked to think of, he thought competition was detrimental to younger people developing their characters. He didn't want them to have competition as young children. So we have to find a way to make this competition be with oneself. Can we really make a goal and reach it by trying to get better and better each day. And it is a very difficult thing, I think, sometimes to communicate to parents because everyone sees one piece and they want to learn the piece. Well, remember, there is so much technique on all the instruments and all the different method books of Suzuki for all instruments, of that one measure in a song might be teaching them something that they need to develop for years. And I think that if we could just remember that every little step, if they're doing it better the next day, that's where the competition should be focused, with yourself and getting better each day. How does that sound to you, Eri?
I think that sounds perfect. It's just so hard in practice. and,
Yes.
and it's sort of the whole group lessons and seeing all other kids playing which piece and whatever. I mean, I think Dr. Suzuki even recognized this in his own time and talks about it and, reprimands or kind of kindly asks parents to be more reflective and sort of think back on the reason why they wanted their children to learn instruments in the first place.
Right.
But I think the system itself sort of encourages that kind of not competition culture, but the temptation to compare. Basically, it's like getting different color belts in martial arts, right?
Right. Well, I'm glad I got to my takeaway thought, because it sounds like we're even overtime for questions, right, Angelica? Should we get to the questions?
Yeah, that's okay.
Do you have questions? Okay, great.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both so much for already the wonderful insight that you've given us. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Angelica Cortez. I'm the executive director of the Suzuki Association, and I'm just here to facilitate some questions. And maybe actually just to start on the note that you all were just on, it's the thing that I personally really took away about Suzuki from this book was just his endless curiosity, right? There was just always something to tweak and change, whether it was about himself or his own teaching or about, trying to get some material into a student's head. It was constant change. And maybe Eri, you can bring us in a little bit on the folks who influence Suzuki's thinking in that way. And maybe Kristen, you can talk a little bit about how you see that playing into the method itself.
Well, I think to start, I think the biggest influence on Suzuki's character, I assume, was his father, who was so inventive. He was an inventor of different things, but he was an instrument maker, shamisen, which is Japanese three-stringed instrument. But he switched to violin making, thinking that there'd be larger markets in the late 19th century. And that's what he did. And he really, through trial and error, made this huge violin factory that became the biggest in the world. Basically, when World War I happened, Germany could not keep up with international orders. So Suzuki Violin became this biggest violin manufacturer of mid-range violins. But he was not just a businessman. According to different recollections, this guy, Masakichi Suzuki, Suzuki's father, actually was constantly innovating and just doing things, experimenting. And that really was the biggest influence that Dr. Suzuki had growing up, seeing him try different things. If something doesn't work, he'll try something different ways and just not get discouraged. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that come to my mind. Yeah. So.
And Kristen, how do you see that playing out in the method, that kind of concept of endless curiosity?
Well, I mean, in the method, I think just because there's always something new to teach, and always something new to listen for. Even just that, when we think of even the curiosity that we want to have the kids have, when you first start the kids and they start on only on the E string, and they're so excited to go, they want to hear what the G string sounds like, or on the piano, maybe you only start with the right hand and they want to hear what the left hand starts with. I mean, I think all of these points, like, potential and curiosity and everything, this all came from Suzuki's heart. And that's how it's so ingrained in the method, that to have the kids have that kind of curiosity is just, every piece introduces something new and they're curious to move on.
And then this question is a little bit specific to you, Eri. Were you influenced by the book Nurtured by Love? What other things sort of influenced you in writing this on a personal note?
Right. Nurtured by Love, I actually read when I was 17 or 18, and I talk a little bit about it in the book. I came across it really simply by accident in a bookstore in Tokyo. And I started browsing, and I mean, of course, I had heard about the Suzuki method, but I didn't know any philosophy behind it. And I was actually really surprised and shocked by the kind of innovation and the big thoughts that went with the Suzuki method, which I kind of assumed was a kind of a program for precociously advanced students, which is really like the really reverse of what Dr. Suzuki wanted people to understand it. But because I read that book, I sort of became interested, and I learned the piano traditional way since I was 4. And I regretted very much that my parents didn't know or didn't take a chance on the Suzuki method. So I was determined, if I ever have a child, I'll put him or her through this. So.
I love it. And what do you two see as obstacles to us realizing Dr. Suzuki's vision, and in particular, the vision that you paint for us, Ari, in your book? Or can you name a few of them? I'm sure that's a whole other session, but can you name a few of the obstacles that you see coming up today?
Kristen, would you like to go first? I have to.
Sure. I mean, mine will be just practically in teaching what those obstacles are. And I think we all face it all the time with kids with very busy schedules. And, they're really the heart of this method is the repetition, and the repetition every day. When any of us have heard in any of our Suzuki training that Suzuki says you practice every day that you eat. And, really that this is something that, I mean, back to the tone, is life is instilled in a tone. I mean, really that this has to become something that becomes part of you and part of your home life and part of your family life. And that it's not that it's an obstacle, but it's hard to get people. I can't think of anything else. Well, you can if you think of people doing sports and things, I guess you can really apply it to anything, but there's something about music that's so in the heart and so important that it has to be something that's every day and really part of all your life decisions to make this something that your child can really fully experience. And so there's obstacles in that, because people have busy lives and people have a lot more going on nowadays. And that's just something I see as an obstacle in getting students to practice and to really do it the right way. So, but that's not really, you have probably something more Eri on that.
No, but similarly, no, I as a kind of a Suzuki parent, the most difficult bit was to get my daughter to practice on a regular basis, and sort of I tended to lose temper whenever she resisted or didn't get on with it like quickly enough. So that's like really going against, you know, this idea of love guiding the whole home practice thing. So I felt really bad about it, and I still do. I mean, I still feel surprised that she is still playing the violin. So,
But it's really the hardest job for the parent, and especially in the beginning when the parent is so involved, is that it's, you know, the teacher in the beginning is 1/2 hour a week, and we send them with all the information we can, and we hope to train the parents, but it's the parent that has to do it the other 6 days. And me being on this talk or anywhere as both, being the parent in this situation is way more difficult than being the teacher.
Yeah, and I'll just bring it back, and I know we need to wrap up and emanate here, to just that idea of fighting our human instinct, right? To compete against someone else rather than ourselves, and to, you know, push our student too hard rather than show up with love. It's really kind of fighting that human instinct that acts in disservice sometimes to that bigger goal of teaching. So I'll just say thank you again so much, Eri, and
Thank you for
please,
having
everyone, I
us.
know you're all at home, and Kristen, please join me in thanking these two for being with us today. I also want to just send a huge thank you to our translators, Andre and Araceli, who have done a beautiful job making sure we include so many more members of our community. Thank you all so, so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Angelica. Yes, thank you to Eri and Kristen, as well as our translators, Andrea and Araceli. Please fill out our survey so we can continue to improve our webinars. I will remind you, we'll be sending out an edited replay in about 1 week or so to everyone who registered. So if you have friends or colleagues who couldn't make this live, you'll get to see an edited replay then. And then I put in the chat another link for certificate of attendance, as well as links on how to purchase this great book. I highly recommend it. And thank you so much for everyone joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.